Okay, so for those that have just joined in the last moment or so, welcome. Great to have you back. This is the second webinar in the Unlocking Potential in 2021 program we've been running over the last couple of weeks. So yeah, today's very much about that exact subject about unlocking potential. Whereas obviously last week we focused on the business leader survey report we ran at the back end of last year, which we're not going to dive into this week. We went pretty quick last week to give you as much insight on that as we could. But they're just the three headlines that came out of that report that we ran over last week. That whole issue around leaders struggling to get their businesses aligned to their strategy, the need to really start to deliver on change rather than just managing change, and not surprisingly, I suppose confidence being fairly low, particularly in the UK. Or some differences globally, but that report is now live. If you missed last week, there's a recording of the session, or you can get hold of the report, whichever's easiest for you. And any questions on that, feel free to fire them over to us. I suppose just very quickly on kind of why we're doing this at all, really. Really ultimately it's about helping you get to that next level of performance. The report very much was trying to get you to have a bit more clarity on maybe the issues and the areas you needed to focus on. So then ultimately, you can bridge that gap with the need to unleash that potential. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And for those that have done the report, the dashboard is now live, so you can access that data and that insight in a bit more detail and a bit more of a personalized way. Hopefully that will give you some focus. We will be building that out into some benchmarking and progression analysis as we move into the end of 2021 and into 2022. I just wanted to I think to set the scene for the potential piece itself is when we talk about that next level performance, I think there is also a struggle about kind of what does that even mean. And I think one of the ways to frame that is to look at it in different levels. I think for me, there's four levels. One is, the organizational next level performance. As an organization, what does that look like for us? But there's also, what does that look like for the functions within the business, whether it's sales, marketing, operations, finance, HR. But remember, every function ultimately is made up of a team, and depending on your organization, may be made up of several teams. So you need to think about that next level performance for the function and the teams within it as well. And then ultimately, obviously, all of this is made up by individuals. And I think probably the message here for me is I think most leaders and most organizations are strongest at looking at the organizational level of performance. The challenge for me on that really is that ultimately that's just a scoreboard. It's a bit like playing cricket or football and just looking at the scoreboard rather than worrying about what's going on the pitch. We focus, I think, a lot on individual performance, but I think almost without exception, every organization that we work with admittedly really struggles with really managing that performance management at individual level. So the focus for me is always very organizational, but that's kind of a bit of a so what, because it's the scoreboard. Lots of focus on the individual level, but not really doing a very good job of it, and very little focus in between on kind of really making sure the functions are really working well and getting to that next level, and the teams that drive them as well. And when you look at the survey that we discussed last week, there's lots of stuff in there around how sales and marketing as functions really failing quite badly in most organizations globally. Operations being scored really high on performance, but probably struggling to protect the profit of the business. So I think there's lots of stuff around those middle sections that can really help you if you get some focus in terms of what does next level performance really mean for us, and where do we really need to unlock the potential. So that probably leads us nicely into kind of what we're going to do today. Could I have a quick conversation about kind of what, how much potential is there? I mean, that's an interesting question in itself. Where is it? What are the barriers? And then we're going to introduce you to something called the potential puzzle that we put together to try and help you sort of see, I think, where the areas are that you need to focus on to release potential. And then I've got a couple of leadership tips for you. And then I'll leave a bit of time at the end for some Q&A. So hopefully if there's any questions from the room, we can pick those up and throw them around as we need to. Okay, so on this question of how much potential is there, I think, reflecting on this, I'm not sure that I or anybody can really answer that very objectively. It's quite a subjective question, I think. But I go back to this question. So this is a lady called Liz Wiseman, who ran the Leadership University for Oracle for many, many years and wrote a fantastic book called Multipliers on Leadership. And the whole concept of Liz's book was, in terms of being productive as businesses, we've kind of done the kind of the classic productivity piece to death around being lean and being efficient and cutting cost. And actually where the next big gain in productivity lies is in our people. but on some analysis of management and leadership styles that most of us have been brought up with, most of us have styles that actually diminish people's potential. So we actually suppress their ability to grow and flourish and be better at what they do. Whereas great leaders have been analysed to have what they call a multiplier effect. They actually manage to bring that out of people. So the book is fantastic. If you don't want to read the book, you can get on the website. There's some great content on the website you can look at. But when I pose this question that you see on the screen here, I don't think I've ever, probably of hundreds, even thousands of people I've asked this question to have ever disagreed with this comment. I think all of us agree that pretty much anybody, given the right set of circumstances, has more in them if only we could get them to bring it out of themselves or help them to bring it out of themselves. So I think that the point on that is there's always more potential. This is just a little exercise that I use kind of to get people thinking about this that you might find useful for yourself, but also for your teams. Is I actually say to people, when you actually ask yourself, how much of your potential do you think you're actually using right here, right now? Give them a bit of a thermometer for that. Very rarely do people score themselves much above 50, 60, 70% probably tops. So I think you can actually get people to sort of admit quite openly that, that yes, they're not tapping into their full potential. So it's kind of, if that's the case, if we're not using all our potential, what could we do better? It's just then a question of how, what if, why not? What else could we be doing? And I think it's also good sometimes to have a conversation around the room. If you've got people that think they've ever been in a situation where they have been in a team where maybe 80% plus was being used, because some of the war stories and experiences of those people and those teams are quite useful to sort of pull on to sort of see what could be possible when we really get potential being used. So I think the other thing with potential, I don't think it's a kind of a single journey. It's not like, we have a certain amount of potential, and if we get to the top of that, if we look at it as an analogy of a mountain, then we're done. I think what tends to happen is we get to a point of potential that we've aspired to, and then another mountain opens up. We go, actually, we could probably go a little bit further. And I think all that really stops us is, whether we've got the capability, the capacity, or even the motivation to get there. They're the things that kind of slide us back down our heel, really. But ultimately, if we have those things, I think potential is an ongoing journey, and it's just about how many mountains we want to climb. I think, and for most people, we probably never really completely tap out our potential. It's just a case of where do we get happy and comfortable, sort of laying our flag and saying that's me done. So again, try and think of potential as a kind of ongoing thing. That it's just a case of how far do you want to go, not how do I define what it looks like, and then I've got to try and aspire to that. So in terms of where is it, I think going back to my conversations about next level, I always think it's in three places. It's at individual level, it's at team level, and it's at organizational level. And that in mind, I just want to sort of talk about where it lies in people. And this is a matrix I think is really useful. There's obviously lots of people matrices that exist out there, but I think this one's really good to think about in terms of potential. Is that if you think about your people in terms of the values that they share with you as a business and their performance, people that obviously fit us culturally and have the same values as us and perform well, they're our stars. And we have those others that, are really great people, they fit us, not quite really tapping out the performance levels we want, they're our arrows. And obviously on the other side, we've got those people that just are, quite frankly, a pain in the arse and don't do what we want them to do. And those ones that, really are very, very capable and can do a great job, but, tend to rub everyone up the wrong way. So on that matrix itself, and the obvious place for potential is the arrows, those people that, clearly, we want them around, they fit with the organizations culturally, and there's more there to be had. And I would agree that that is a place of potential. But very often, what you find actually is those people that are already stars, because the potential journey for me is endless, they are the ones that kick on and actually have more to give. And I think this is probably where you need to think about the left-hand side a bit more. I think the crosses, you have to ask yourself, why are they even there? But the question marks as well, we see when they're allowed to hang around a business too long, although they can do a good job, the damage they do in their cultural misalignment can be huge. And often what they do is they create resentment in the high performers, in the stars, that sort of stops them, almost gets them to hold back, wanting to sort of go on to another level. And so we often see when you get rid of those question marks that are, say, are disruptive, that those stars actually then go okay, I'm not resentful now that I'm doing a great job, and I'll kick it on to the next level. So, yes, get your arrows moving up, but, look at your high performers that you already have, because they've all got much more in them, but make sure you haven't got people in your organization that are creating resentment within them. That means they don't actually want to give any more. So that's one area where it is. And the other thing I thought I'd just add to that as well, I think, which kind of just gives it a bit more credence, is we did some work with some leaders on some research about 4 or 5 years ago. And this was something that came out of it, which was really interesting, that when we looked at really, really great leaders, what we found was that clearly, outwardly, they're all very capable because they were all great leaders. They were running great companies, highly successful. But in every instance, when you actually started to investigate, what was going on inside them, in every instance, they were very self-challenged. So they would never sit there going, okay, I'm really, really top of my game. I'm running a great company. I'm highly successful. Amongst my peers, I'm revered. They still were always questioning, am I doing it well enough? Can I be doing more? Could I do it differently? Could I do it better? There was this they're almost sabotaging themselves in a positive way to kick it on to that next level of potential. So I think that really kind of feeds into that model of, high performers actually are where your potential really lies. Okay, so just moving in then to kind of the barriers. And I kind of already alluded to this earlier. For us, there's 4 barriers that stop potential being released. The capability, capacity to do it, having the motivation, but also a sense of direction. I think what you have to have is, if you want to release some potential, you have to kind of know what it looks like, where you're going, what you're trying to be, where you're trying to get to, then have the ability to do it and the capacity to do it, and then have the motivation. And we kind of call the capability and the capacity the kind of the legs, because I think there are lots of people out there with the capability and capacity that probably frustrate the hell out of us as leaders, but just aren't moving to that next level. And often that's where the motivation comes in. You can have all the legs and have a very clear sense of where you want to be, but without the motivation, you probably won't move at all. And I think also, not so common, I think, this type of person, but we do see people that are incredibly enthusiastic and positive. The motivation is there, they're very capable, they've got the capacity to find the time to do it, but actually have no sense of where they're going. So I see them setting lots of goals on a daily, weekly basis, but not to achieve anything specific. So they're not releasing their potential because they have no sense of direction. So everyone's different, but I think, the clues lie in those 4 things. But going back to, it runs at organizational and team level as well. You can use this analogy through your organization. You can say, as a business, do we have a clear sense of direction? Do we have the capability within the organization? Do we have the capacity? Do we have the desire to even do it at all? I think you can ask those same questions of an organization and of a team, and start to look at where the answers lie for you. And again, remember, when you're thinking about this in terms of people or the organization, it isn't a single journey. Once one journey is completed, think about, okay, what's that next level of potential and performance look like for us? And then what's the next level of capability we need? But the great thing I think with releasing potential is when you get to the top of one kind of aspiration, whatever the next one looks like, you take with you what you've already had from the last one. So you kind of that's why it kind of gives you the legs to start with, because you've got some capability, capacity, you just might need to boost it somewhat. But often the big driver is that motivation. Okay, so this is kind of where the potential puzzle comes in, because we want to kind of build on those 4 areas. We see those 4 areas as a bit of a puzzle that ultimately, if you get them right, enables you to release potential. But it's a puzzle because we were hoping we'd find a really simple classic management consultancy Venn diagram to sort of sum this up. But the truth is it's bloody complex, quite frankly. So when we really started to map this out, we ended up with a puzzle that looked a bit like this. So what I wanted to do sort of for the rest of the session is just give you a bit of I suppose, just a quick overview of this puzzle and kind of what does it mean, and then a couple of tips, because clearly we can't cover this all off in the next sort of 15, 20 minutes, that you can take with you to maybe start on some of the more difficult areas. In terms of that direction, I think it's fairly straightforward in terms of, for me, direction means there's some form of dream, ultimately. You might call it a vision, you might call it an aspiration, an ambition, but it's ultimately some kind of, wish of where you want to get to. But direction also needs to come with some purpose. So kind of why are we even doing this at all? Why am I doing this at all, if I'm thinking about it on an individual level? But any kind of dream and purpose needs to have some goals put alongside it, and some sort of plan or system that means you're likely to achieve that dream you have. I think that the piece in this section really is there are lots of people in the world that either obsess about the kind of the visions and the dreams and the ambition, but don't really work hard on the rigor of the goals and the plans to achieve it. And there are lots of people that are very goal orientated but have nothing to pin that to. And the truth is you need both to be aligned together. When you start to look at the need for capability, it isn't just about learning. Yes, you need to learn things, but I think very often for people we need to unlearn and relearn and find that things have changed and do it a different way. But we know that, learning is only about competency. It's not about capability. There are lots of people, particularly in this educated world, that are very, very competent, but don't seem to be able to do the things we want them to do. And that's because they don't have capability. And capability only comes from applying that knowledge and that learning, experimenting with it and getting feedback so you can refine it, because we never get it right first time, that then builds the capability to do something. So I think the watch there is watch for those people that are very, very intelligent very often, but don't seem to be able to actually apply it into doing anything. What you've got there is a mass of knowledge and learning without the experience, the experimentation and the feedback to refine it. In terms of sort of jumping around a bit here, but in terms of the capacity on the right, ultimately, people need to be productive. So, if people are going to move to the next level of performance and unlock that potential, they need to find time. And that's going to come down to their personal productivity. Things like time management would sit in there, obviously, but also their energy. Do they have the personal energy? Do the people around them give energy or drain it? Is the environment they're in giving them energy? If any of those things are missing, then the capacity piece will fall out of this puzzle, and that potential probably will not be released. And then when you come into the middle, you get, motivation. Are people's needs being met, or are there consequences for them not doing the things they need to do to get to that next level? Does it all fit with their core beliefs and values? We know that people progressing and growing is highly motivating. Is that happening? Are people getting progression? Are people growing? If not, they won't be being motivated. Do they have the mindset? Do they have the grit and the determination to get to where they need to get to? So those kind of things all kind of fit into the 4 boxes, but there are things that I think go across all of it. So you'll see at the top there's the wiring. People are wired in different ways. They have different personalities, they have different behavioral traits, they have different motivators. If we were in a world of sport, the wiring is highly important. Michael Phelps is wired to be a swimmer, where other people are wired to be long distance runners. And there's no way with any amount of effort and grit and determination you can turn a long distance runner into an Olympic swimmer, and vice versa. But I think actually, for most of the things that we have in business, most people's wiring is probably less important. And even things like, DNA, we know is very plastic, and our brains can be changed from what we're born with. But I think there are still things in people's profiles and the way they're made up that will give you clues as to where they're likely to be able to be most effective and most be able to release their potential. So profiling is probably a place to start there for sort of people that haven't thought about that before. And obviously things like, the need to get rid of old habits, build new habits, the need to be able to embrace and actually change, and ultimately the need to become more self-aware and more emotionally intelligent, all things that will kind of run for all these elements of the puzzle. So there's lots in there. What I'm going to do with that is I'm going to send you, as soon as this is finished today, a bit of a handout, just so you can just, I think, take some time to reflect on this. For me, this isn't an exact exercise. I think it's more about just taking those sections and just thinking about it, reflecting on it. What are the challenges and barriers you have in those areas? And then maybe thinking about some action you ought to take, and probably think about that, maybe for yourself, maybe then for your organization, and then maybe then start to think about passing it on to some people in your business, just to start a different conversation about, where are we getting stuck? Where are we failing to unlock that potential that you have within yourself or within the business? And I think probably the thing to finish on that is be prepared. There's some people actually, when it comes down to it, don't want to. And then you have to ask yourself, are we happy with them staying where they are? Do they still serve us effectively? Or do we need to make some kind of change? And I think a lot of people, going back to that earlier comment about performance management, is that, that ultimately is where you get to with people. And I think people tend to shy away from having that conversation or making that decision on somebody where there's some kind of emotional connection with them, having worked for them over often a number of years. Okay, so just a couple of leadership tips that I thought I'd share with you that I think link into the puzzle itself. The first thing is kind of just focusing around this need for progression and growth, and kind of starting to touch on the mindset piece, which I think is probably the trickiest one for most people to start to get their head around. So I'm going to start with this notion of barriers, because barriers ultimately mean growth. But what I mean by that is, if we are about to face a barrier, so if we're thinking about this in terms of progressing ourselves and our potential, let's say, we need to learn to public speak. I'm just using this as a random example. that might be a bit frightening. So we walk towards the need. Okay, I've got to learn to be a public speaker. I've got to go and do some public speaking. And what we tend to do is we tend to walk away from it. We don't tend to face up to that challenge, that difficult thing we need to do. And then we get a bit of an arrow in our back. Maybe our boss says to us, "Oh, come on, look, if you want that promotion, you're going to have to learn to do this." Or maybe the arrow comes from ourselves, where we go, "Come on, you want to progress your career, you want to grow your company." But eventually what you get is enough arrows in your back where, you can call it procrastinating, maybe the kinder way of saying maybe you're just getting ready to face that challenge, but eventually you kind of push through it. And whenever you push through it, however long it takes, it's always uncomfortable. But when you get to the other side, you're bigger and stronger and more capable, with a big smile on your face. And you kind of look back and go, kind of, why did I take so long? Why didn't I do that sooner? Of course, then the next barrier comes up and you kind of do exactly the same thing again. You kind of walk up to it and go, "Oof, that looks a bit difficult. That looks a bit challenging. That's a bit scary." And I think this is where you can start to think about barriers slightly differently. If you can start to be conscious of this, rather than thinking of them as barriers, start to think of them as growth opportunities. And what if I actually had a proactive plan to actually start to look and seek out growth opportunities that would normally be seen as barriers to me, that I would procrastinate over, and start to see them as growth opportunities. I think for leaders particularly, I think how we grow through issues and barriers often is a big indicator of our character, of how people see us and of who we are. So maybe some tips on this is first of all, be very conscious of this, because this is kind of what we do. But what if we can be conscious of this, and what if we didn't wait? What if we just went, whenever it happens, I'm just going to push straight through it? What if everything that did happen to us that wasn't planned, we just took an attitude of it's an opportunity to grow. So I'm not going to bemoan it. I'm just going to embrace it and push through it, because whatever happens, I'm going to learn and grow from this. I see very, very successful people actually creating barriers to grow. So they will almost physically create barriers and difficult situations just as an opportunity to learn and grow. And I think conversely on that, when terrible things happen, often they do create really positive outcomes. I met a fascinating character when I was down in Australia about 4 years ago, who had lost his legs. He'd been a professional sportsman and lost his legs. So that was, I think that for anybody, that's a pretty traumatic thing. For a professional sportsman, it was horrific. But he said to me, the day I turned my life around was the day I actually said me losing my legs was a gift for me, because by that point I met him, he started 3 charities. He was doing all sorts of incredible things in the world, and doing things he never would have even probably thought of doing before he lost his legs. But he said that really stuck with me, where he said to me, the day I realized it was a gift, because it enabled me to do all these other things that I never would have done otherwise, was just like when you start to do that in your head, and if you maybe do that for yourself, it's quite incredible how psychologically that changes your whole outlook on the world. And obviously what we've been through with COVID is probably a great opportunity to start doing that, to think about, what are the gifts that COVID has given you, despite the fact obviously some terrible things have happened as well. So that's barriers. That's a really good one in terms of, the need for progression and growth, and maybe being a bit more proactive on that. The second tip I wanted to give you, I suppose, well, before I do that, I think probably the message out of the barriers bit is that there's definitely, you don't grow or learn or progress without being uncomfortable. So there is this notion of, just getting comfortable, being uncomfortable. So as leaders, obviously we need to embrace that ourselves. But I think, with our people, helping them recognize that's going to be a new normal for them, and actually maybe just supporting them in that in the early days as well, because it is a little bit scary for people to be uncomfortable. People like to feel they're in control and they know what they're doing. They know they've got their shit. But of course, that isn't the way the world works. So sorry, I missed that slide out. And just the second tip was I think around leadership itself. So I'm going to go back to the Multipliers book that I mentioned at the start of this session today, which talks about these 2 men, 2 probably of our most famous prime ministers, Gladstone and Disraeli, and how people used to very often say, when you met Gladstone, you were incredibly impressed. And when he left the room, you went, God, he's amazing. He's definitely the smartest person I've ever met. When Disraeli left the room, he didn't leave that impression, but he kind of left you feeling that you were the smartest person in the room. And they're 2 very, very different things. And I think in terms of unlocking potential as leaders, I think they're really, really important, because what you've got here is a difference between what I call inspirational and aspirational leadership. So I often, we talk about leadership obviously all the time and what we do, but everyone talks about leaders needing to be inspirational. But when people start to really explain what they mean by that, or give me examples of inspirational, what they're really talking about is aspirational. They're looking at somebody that's been successful, that they kind of like to be like. Wouldn't it be great to be him, to be her? And I'm not bemoaning that, because I think there's a place for that. I think people need things to aspire to, but ultimately, if people are going to truly unlock their potential, they need to be inspired to be the things that they want to be, the best that they can be, because it's by their own measure. And I think great leaders make that distinction. Yes, they understand that they're on display. They need to set examples. They need to, they need to be aspirational to a point, but they recognize that at the end of the day, people truly being totally successful and truly unlocking their potential is about them being the best that they can be and want to be. And how can I help them? And that requires a leader to completely shift from a focus on them to a focus on the individual. That have to become selfless, and the orientation moves to the other person. And that's a very difficult shift, I think, for some leaders, particularly as many leaders have got egos to do. But for me, if you really want to unlock potential in people, you need to make that shift from being aspirational to being inspirational, and really making it all about the person and helping them get where they need to be, not about you being this impressive thing that people look up to. Okay, so wanted to keep it a lot shorter today after last week's marathon, and I wanted to leave some time for questions if there are any. But in terms of just what next, as we said last week, in terms of the report is now published, and for those that have done it, your access is open to the platform. And as I said, I'm very happy from the report or from these sessions to give some feedback to people if they've got any questions. I've asked for a bit of time to be left in my diary to do that. If you didn't do the report, you can still go on and do the report, so you can get access to the platform. So feel free to jump on and do that if you haven't already. And for those that want to get involved in the Director Circle and kind of get involved in this stuff on a more regular basis, particularly now we have our roadmap. I mean, we haven't stopped during COVID. We've been virtualizing as everybody has, but we've got sessions coming up that will remain virtual, but our physical sessions are opening up from June onwards as well. So there's a whole new roadmap of peer sessions and peer meetings between various directors and leaders that will be opening up through March, April, and out and through into June when we become physical again, which I think will be great for us all to do, if nothing for our own sanity. So in terms of summary, ahead of any questions, so I think the headlines for me is there is always more potential that's being realized. I think it's really hard to define how much, and I think it's different for different people, but there's always more than we think. Look at individual, team and organizational levels, because I think they're slightly different contexts, but you can use this thinking for all of those things. I think often the most potential is in the highest performers. It's not, in those young, we do need to bring those young people through, but often those people that are already smashing it for us, have still got a lot more to give, because that's the way potential works. And the fact they've already gone onto those levels probably tells you they're the people that want to release more potential, want to be ambitious, and just be really careful that particularly your culturally misaligned people are not undermining that, because they do create resentment amongst the high performers. As a side to that, great leaders continually self-challenge. So probably the question for us here in this room is, are we challenging ourselves continually, regardless of how successful we may have been? And ultimately, it's about these four things. It's about having that clear sense of direction, having the capability to do it, not competency, creating the capacity. I suppose the thing I didn't say in capacity is, people that are truly ambitious, will find the capacity. It's really easy for those people that are not ambitious just to be too busy. So beware the too busy as well. And ultimately, do we have the motivation? Because it's okay having the legs, but if the motivation isn't there, then we'll just stand still. And embrace those barriers for growth. I think, that's a real, for me, a big mindset shift if you can start to think like that. And if you can get to that place where we can be comfortable being uncomfortable and be more inspirational and aspirational, then I think you'll start to make some inroads into that challenge of unlocking potential. So I'm going to leave that there today. I'll just come off the share and leave that with you guys. If there's any questions in the chat, I'll pick those up. Or if you just want to raise your hands, there's not so many of us today because we've run this a few times now. So I'm happy just to open up the mics and have a conversation, but I'll leave that to you guys. If there's anything in there particularly you want to speak about or just want me to expand on. I'll just give it another minute because I know some people like to just gather their thoughts. But if I've done them without, so there's no questions, I'll wrap us up. Okay, I don't think we've got, I think stand silent today, which is fine. I'm not going to force people to speak or ask questions. As I said, but I'm here. If there's anything sort of post today, feel free to reach out. Happy to take any questions. I will send out that handout so you can reflect on that puzzle, because there's a lot to reflect on in there. But I didn't want to, though we like to make things simple, we don't like to dumb things down either. So I wanted to make sure that, you had all the pieces, and hopefully we'll give you some clues into where you need to look to start to find the areas where you're getting blocked on unlocking that potential, whether it's in your organization or in your individual people or in yourselves. So thanks for joining us, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Thank you.